I love upcycling, and I'm sure you do too. But do you have trouble sometimes when you're upcycling with sweaters? Today, I'm going to show you 3 common mistakes that you might be making when you're upcycling sweaters. And I'm going to show you how to solve them so that way upcycling sweaters can be a breeze. Real quick before we start, if you're looking to learn more about sewing, make sure you check out my online courses and my sewing club. There's a link down below. Now let's get back to mastering sweaters. The first thing we're gonna go over is what to do when you cut into the sweater and it starts unraveling. How do you deal with this so you don't end up with holes in all your seams? This might have happened to you. You cropped a sweater, you wore it a few times, you washed it, and then all of a sudden there's a hole, but you sewed it. Why is there a hole there? So I'm gonna cut the rib knit here off at the bottom. So I'm just cutting right through the sweater, right through the knit, so I can show you what's happening. So it looks fine when we initially cut through it. Just looks like a piece of fabric we cut into. But on a knit sweater, when we start pulling this, you're going to watch all the little knits start to unravel. So think about when you're washing and wearing something and all of these knits start to come apart. So you can see the knit here just coming apart. So it's just gonna pop right out. So we need to make sure this isn't happening to you. Otherwise, that Weezer song is gonna get stuck in your head all day long. So what are we gonna do about this? So there are a few different solutions. Essentially what we need to do is bind that edge to keep all of those little knits together so they don't start unraveling while we're working with it or wearing it. So let's check out our options on the sewing machine and the serger. So I'm at the sewing machine and I'm going to show you 3 different stitches you can use to finish your edge. So you can use the broken zigzag, you can use the overcast that's on an angle, or you can even use the regular zigzag stitch. So no matter what stitch you're choosing today, you want to make sure that you're making your stitch length a little longer. I'm also going to be lowering my foot pressure to 3. So you might not have this button on your machine, but you have a way to lower your foot pressure. So you want to make sure you're lowering the foot pressure, so less pressure on your fabric. This is going to prevent it from stretching out. So I'm going to demo the broken zigzag right along this edge here, which is about to fall apart. So I'm going to make sure that the stitch is going off the edge and on the edge. So that way it's binding the fibers together. And make sure you're not stretching your fabric when you're doing this. And I'm just going to stop here and then show you the results. So you can see we have the edge there bound together with the broken zigzag. Now if I try to pull it apart, you can see that the knits don't want to fall apart. Might get a fuzzy or 2 that's popping off, but we're not going to get those strands of knits. So now your sweater is not going to come undone and it still stretches. You might be wondering, why am I using these certain types of stitches? Well, we're going to go over that later. Right now, let's head over to the serger and I'm going to show you how you can beautifully finish your edge of the sweater with a serger. So the serger is awesome for finishing the edge and cutting off all the little bits. But before we start serging, let's make sure we change some of our tensions and dials. So I'm going to be working with the 4-thread overlock. I'm going to take my stitch length and I'm going to make it longer. I'm going to make it all the way up to 4.5. And my differential feed, I'm going to make this up to 2. So the differential feed is going to prevent it from stretching out when the number is higher. When you have a lower differential feed number, it's going to stretch out your fabric. So you really want to make sure you're changing your differential feed to a higher number. I'm also going to take my foot pressure and make it 1. This means that the foot pressure is going to be less on the fabric, so it's going to prevent our fabric from stretching out when we have a lower number here. The nice thing about a serger is that there's a blade here, so it's going to cut off these little extra bits that are fraying and bind the edge at the same time. So when we put it through the serger, we just guide it and it'll cut off any of the little frayed bits, and then it's going to bind the edge, preventing it from fraying any further or unraveling since it's a sweater. And now I'm going to serge off. And right here, I've finished the edge with the serger, and you can see how nice it looks bound on the edge and how any of those little frayed bits, they're just gone because the serger just chopped them off. And if we try to pull anything out of this sweater, it is not going anywhere. It is bound in there. Nothing's coming off. And finishing the edge with a serger is by far my favorite way to finish the edge of sweaters. Another common mistake people make while they're sewing sweaters is stretching it while they're sewing. So if your fabric is stretching while you're sewing it, there's a good chance it's gonna stay permanently stretched out, and then it's gonna look like a wobbly sea creature. Pretty cool, but not what we're looking for. So let's take a look at an example of stretching while you're sewing, and then I'm gonna show you how to solve this. So I'm using a knit stitch, just like I should be in my regular sewing machine. So now I have a seam, but oh no, look at it. It's all wavy. So you can see how wavy the seam is here. That is not good. When we open this up, look at that seam. It is not laying flat. So what was the problem there? It looked like I was sewing everything fine. So let me show you what I was doing wrong and how we can fix it so we get a nice flat seam in this knit sweater fabric. So one thing I was doing wrong is that I had too much pressure on my foot, making it hard to control the fabric. So I'm going to adjust my foot pressure with this 2 layers of thick fabric. I'm going to make it 1. And while I'm here, I'm also going to make my stitch length longer. I'm going to make it 4. And I am using my knit stitch, my stretch stitch on my regular sewing machine. And another thing I was doing wrong is I was stretching it too much while I was sewing and trying to line up the edges. So we just want to keep a light hand pressure on it, enough to guide it through, but you really don't want to be stretching this while it's going into the machine, even if you feel like it's making it line up better. So now we're going to sew this seam with the adjusted tensions. And notice I'm just letting the machine do the work. My hands are just here to guide. Yeah, look at that. Look at how nice and flat this seam is. It's beautiful, and it still has some stretch to it, and it's not gonna pop and fall apart, but it's nice and flat. And when we open it, we've got a nice flat seam here. So you can really see a difference when we look at these 2 seams. This one is beautiful and flat, and this one's like riding a roller coaster. And if you're using a serger to sew your seams together, the same things apply. Less foot pressure, do not pull and stretch out your fabric, just let the machine take it, and make sure you're using a longer stitch length. And that's gonna give you a beautiful seam, not like a stretched out crazy seam like a sea creature. We don't want those. Another huge mistake people make is not using the right stitch for your seams when sewing up a sweater. Let's go to the sewing machine and I'll show you. So I have my straight stitch on, and I'm going to sew up a seam in this finely woven pink knit. So when this is sewn together with a straight stitch, it does look a little wavy, but it also has another issue. When you go to move in it, it pops. Look at this, all the stitches came out there. You are going to have holes in your project if you are sewing these fine knits with a straight stitch. And what's the solution? Well, let me show you. So when using a straight stitch on stretchy fabric, this stitch is going to pop and break when the fabric stretches. So we need to choose another stitch. We are going to choose our stretch stitch. Now most machines have this stitch. I like to call it the little lightning bolt stitch. It's a zigzag and a straight stitch essentially merged together. And this stitch stretches with the fabric, so you're not going to get any popped stitches. Now there are 2 other things you're going to want to do for a perfect stretch seam. We're going to adjust our foot pressure, and we're also going to increase our stitch length. So I'm going to create a seam with my stretch stitch. So I'm going to back stitch, and now let's check out that sample. So you can see our seam here with that stretch stitch, and now when I pull it, it does not pop. I can pull it all the way and it doesn't pop. And if you take a close look at it, it essentially looks like a straight stitch when I'm stretching it out. So it basically stretches into a straight stitch. So there are a few exceptions to the rule, always, right? Well, check this out. When you use a really thick, like spongy sweater, A lot of times you can use a straight stitch. So this one here has been straight stitched, and check this out. It doesn't pop or move because the open weave on the sweater is so big. So right here we have a regular straight stitch, and when I stretch it, it does not pop and it comes right back to the form that it was in. So this works because this fabric has such an open weave to it. So in general, when you're working with your super stretchy sweaters, you really want to be using your knit stitch or a little zigzag, and preferably a serger. That is really going to give you the best outcome, but sometimes that straight stitch sneaks on in there. So today you learned how to finish the edges of sweater knits. You also learned how to not get a super wavy, crazy sea creature looking seam. And then you also learned what stitch you should be using when you're creating seams on your sweater knits. So with all of this knowledge, you should be able to create beautiful sweater upcycles. If you have any questions about upcycling sweaters or problems you're running into, leave it down below in the comments and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Or if you have a favorite tip you love to follow, share it down below with everyone as well. Thank you so much for watching today. I hope you enjoyed learning about different techniques and tips when you're working with those knit sweaters, because they can be a pain. We all know that, right? And if you want to learn more about sewing, make sure you check out my online sewing courses and my sewing club. There's links down below in the description. And if you're in Chicago, come on into the design studio and take some classes with me in person. It's a lot of fun. And if you want to know what's going on in the studio, well, make sure you check out my Instagram stories. Thank you so much for watching today. Bye.